some decisions in life are simple, relatively simple anyway. For example, the menu contains your favourite meal. That's a simple decision. Or perhaps you're offered the dream job, the one you really wanted. Simple decision to accept it. The person you're in love with asks you to marry them. Even that can be a simple decision, providing certain caveats are in place. I know for me, it was a very simple decision 30 odd years ago when I met the lady that was right for me. It was a very straightforward decision for me to ask her to marry me. But some decisions in life are much more complicated than that. And I would suggest the reason decisions become complicated is because they contain conflicts. I had a friend once when I was very young. She was 16 years old and she had two twin brothers asked her to go on a date with her to the movies. In the end, she decided to go with neither, and I can't say I blame her. But I've known people in the past, and I had this situation about 35 years ago, where I was offered two jobs, and I had to really ruminate for a while before deciding which one to take. So as I say, some decisions in life can become more complicated, and generally the more complicated they become, the more important they are. Just as an aside, I don't know how many times I've had someone tell me that they're having a hard time finding a job, and then when they've actually made the decision to sit down and pray about it, they've had two offers come along of two jobs, and they've maybe had a little bit of conflict about deciding which one to take. I've come across that scenario several times in my life. Well, in the Bible today, we're starting a new chapter in Genesis chapter 46. We're going to be staying a couple of days in this chapter working through it, because at this point in the Bible, we're hearing the story of this man called Jacob, the father of Joseph, someone who've been following along for quite a long time now, and he's facing this kind of a situation. He's got an important decision to make, and at the time when these events occur, he's living in the land called Canaan. You see, on one hand, he had had an invitation to move with his sons and his family and his extended family and move to Egypt. But on the other hand, he knew that Canaan was the land that God had promised not just him, but Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his father, before him. And he had also lived in Canaan for many years, and he was uncomfortable with the thought of leaving it, because that was the land that he believed God had given to him and his descendants. So on one hand he was conflicted, namely because there was famine in that land and he couldn't stay there, or at least if he did stay there, there was the distinct possibility that he and his family would starve to death. But on the other hand, there was this offer of food and security from his son in Egypt. So clearly he has a decision to make. What should he do? And particularly, what should he do, considering he knew it was the will of God in the long term for him and his descendants to inherit this land of Canaan where he was currently living? God was certainly able to end the famine in Canaan if it was his will, if it was the will of God to do that. But for him to go to Egypt and to escape the famine and to be united with his son, that also had hit its promise, and also he could see how God's will could play out in that. So should he leave this land, the land that God had promised his forefathers, and take him and all his extended family, all his descendants, and go to Egypt? So herein lies the heart of the matter. What decision should he make, and on what basis should he make that decision? Well, I think if we see what he decided to do and how he decided and what reasoning he had behind it when he decided to do it, well, it might help us. It might even influence us in some decisions we have to make in the future. If we understand this passage properly, I can believe it can help us solve some of the tensions for us when it comes to our decision making. It can help us to have an insight into the basis of correct decision making, no less than that. You know, I wish I'd known what this passage taught when I was younger, before I made some of the decisions that I made as a young man. So let's talk about decision making, and we're going to talk about it by looking at Jacob and considering the decision he had to make is whether he should stay or not, whether he should go or not and leave the land of Canaan. So let's begin by turning to Genesis chapter 46, and I'll just read the opening verse 1 for you. So Israel, as you'll remember, that's the other name, the new name given for Jacob. So Israel took his family and journeyed with all he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Now we'll pause right away there and just hold on a minute, because I feel I need to give you some background, particularly if you've just arrived at this point today for the first time. I've just referred to the fact that there was famine going on, and as you will recall from the previous chapters that if you looked at, if you've been journeying with us through the Bible, one of his sons, Joseph, many years previously, well over 20 years ago, had been sold into slavery, and he'd ended up in this land of Egypt, and he was based there for a number of years, long before the famine actually took place. But when the famine took place and spread into the whole region, including Canaan, where Jacob was based, Jacob sent his sons, all his remaining sons, down to Egypt to buy food. Now you see, after a series of events, and miraculous events, and God working providentially, they discovered that Joseph had in fact their brother was now prime minister or vice president of Egypt. So Joseph had sent his brothers back to Canaan and said to them, he revealed himself to them, but he sent his brothers back to Canaan after a long convoluted series of events. And he says, he reveals himself as their brother, the one that they thought had died many years ago, and tells him to tell their father, Jacob, stroke Israel, to come back to Egypt. He tells them this, and he also tells them he's able to take care of this because following a series of miraculous events, he's actually been put in charge of storing up all the food and the administration of the situation in anticipation of this famine that's coming, because it was Joseph who was able to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh that predicted the famine was coming. So what this verse is telling us is now that Jacob has decided at this point, yeah, it's right to go to Egypt. So he packs up everything and he starts heading towards Egypt. And that's what verse 1 tells us. But it also tells us he arrives in Beersheba. So we're right at the southern tip of the promised land. So at this point, he's still in the original promised land, the land that the God had promised him and his descendants. But clearly, he's made a decision to go into Egypt. He's just about to cross over into Egypt, where he pauses and makes a sacrifice. Now, this is the point where I need to ask, on what basis did he make that decision to move? To initially pick up sticks and head towards Egypt. Now, we have to declare that there's nothing in the text which tells us that God revealed to him up to this point that he should go to Egypt, or that he had any way of knowing at that point, discerning exactly what the will of God is. But he just picked up his stuff at Hebron and he starts to head towards Egypt, and he got to this point right on the tip of Canaan, just before entering Egypt. So I hope you don't think I'm reading between the lines, but I think up to this point, I think he's just operating on common sense. I would like to say he makes this decision based on the common sense reality of the situation that he and his family are facing. Frankly, there probably wasn't a whole lot else he could do. As I said, the famine was in the land and it was getting more and more severe, and if he had chosen to stay in Canaan, then he would have faced extreme hunger and the possible starvation and extermination of his entire family. And of course, the other issue is he had not seen his son Joseph, his beloved son, in many years. And now he was being told that he simply had to travel down to Egypt and he would be able to be reunited with his son Joseph there. So I'd say, based on simply common sense, he packs up and goes to Beersheba. But look again at verse 1. You see, in a sense, he's practically responding to the reality of the situation and he and his family, the situation that he and his family find themselves in. But he's trusting that God will act providentially in the everyday and will reveal his will to him. But it also tells us that when he gets to this point at Beersheba, he offers sacrifices to the God of his father, the God of his father Isaac. Now, I think it's interesting because if I'm correct, he simply made the decision because he believed it was the right thing to do. It was common sense. But clearly, by pausing at this point and offering a sacrifice, he still had not left behind his commitment to the Lord. In fact, we will see as he gets later and later into life, that commitment to the Lord becomes even deeper. But at Beersheba, he offers sacrifices to the Lord. In other words, it's showing, yes, he's operating in common sense, but he's clearly, what he's doing, he's not leaving God out of it. He's clearly not doing something that is contrary or to the Lord's will, and he's not doing anything that suggests he's dropping away from his commitment to serve the Lord. You see, in the Old Testament, the offering of sacrifices was an indication of someone's relationship to the Lord. It was a real temperature test of their commitment to the Lord. So even though there's not been any revelation, if you like, disclosed directly at this point that he should go to Egypt, he's doing so based on necessity, which I'm calling common sense, yet very clearly he's no evidence that this is contrary to the will of God. And that's why when he gets to Beersheba, he sacrifices there. Then verse 2 tells us, and God spoke to Israel, and that's Jacob, in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. So having initially decided, without directly hearing from the Lord, he sets off, but in the middle of the trip at this pause, just before he enters the land of Egypt, he does hear from him, and the Lord appears to him and says, don't be afraid to go to Egypt, for this is according to my will. I have no doubt if the Lord had said to him, turn back and remain in Canaan, he would have done that, but here he's being told, don't be afraid to go to Egypt, for this is according to my will. Now, I don't think he knew what the will of God is before he got there, and at this point he set up and made a sacrifice, but there's no indication in the text that he had any sort of vision or message from the Lord before that. So he makes a decision based on practical reality, and during the trip, God later confirms it. The text continues. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the cart that Pharaoh had sent to transport him. So Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and their possessions that they had acquired in Canaan. Jacob brought with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons and his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring. So I believe in all that's going on here, we're simply seeing that God is confirming that this is where he wants them to go. Look at verse 3 at the end, which said, remember, God said, I will make you a great nation there. Now that's interesting. Why is God going to take Jacob to Egypt to make him a great nation? Why didn't he just leave him and let him do that in Canaan? Well, if you look at the book of Genesis carefully and some of the passages we've covered previously, you will recall that it told us that some of his sons intermarried with Canaanite women. Now, the reason I believe God allowed them now to go to Egypt, or part of the reason, was there would be no way that Egyptians would normally intermarry with outsiders. You see, a lot of the Canaanite customs were in fact abomination to the Egyptians. We were told that a few chapters ago. So by going to Egypt, God's plan to make a great nation of Israel and Egypt would come about without there being any or very limited intermarriage between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Anything that might dilute this family line of Israel any further. You see, there was such rampant idolatry in Egypt, it's likely that they wouldn't want to, or the Israelites wouldn't want to, or wouldn't even be allowed to enter into Egyptian society anymore. Anyway, therefore, it was much less likely that as a nation they would depart from the Lord while they stayed there. In a sense, they would sort of, although living there, sojourning there, they would, to a great degree, live in isolation as a people. And we'll see in a minute they will further be isolated down in Goshen. Now, Goshen was a great area to be and was fertile, but the Egyptians, by sending them down there, means that they would, in a sense, remain isolated from Egyptian culture, isolated socially, and therefore there would be very limited opportunity for them to intermarry, and also by nature it means there would be very limited, or in fact no, involvement in Egyptian idolatry. So I believe through all of these events, God is saying it's okay, take all of your extended family and all of your possessions and go to Egypt. Now what happens in the next part of this passage is nothing more than a long list of names. Now it starts in verse 8 and goes all the way through to verse 27, and we are given the names of all those people who went down with Jacob into Egypt. Now, I'm not exactly sure what to do with this very long passage of scripture to read it, because to read it will only identify the people by name. I'm not sure that's very profitable, frankly, but I think what I'd like to do is just give you a basic analysis of what this long stretch of verses, this list of names, tells us. But the main text, so I'm not going to read it as I normally do from verses 8 to 27, but this text within these verses that I'm covering in this next section, although I'm not going to read it, they're going to be included in their entirety in the podcast episode notes. So you can go and see them there, or of course you could look at them on your Bible. And that would be helpful as I quickly explain what is meant and what is covered in those 19 verses. So they're broken into parts. So for example, in the first part, which is verses 8 to 15, we are given the children and the grandchildren of Rachel's wife Leah. These are the sons of Leah, and there are 8 and there are 15 names of grandsons of Leah. So in verses 16 to 18, we're given the sons of Zilpah, Jacob's second wife, and the servant whom Laban, who was Rachel, the wife Rachel's father, gave to Leah, his daughter and his niece. So Jacob also marries her, and she bears 16 children to Jacob. Now, if you recall the story, when Jacob fled because his brother Esau threatened to kill him, he ended up with two, if you like, normal wives, sisters, but he also took as concubines the two maids of the two initial wives. And the passage is telling us that Leah had loads of children and Zilpah had loads of children. The text says that Leah had 33 in total, wow, and that Zilpah had 16. Then, in verses 17 to 22, we are told about the sons of Rachel. So the sons of Rachel are given in verses 17 to 22, and we're told that she had 14 in all. And then there's one more category in verse 23 to 25, where we're given the story of Bilhah, who was Rachel's maid, who Jacob took as a concubine, and if you recall, he had children by her. So in essence, Jacob has 4 wives, and each of them have plenty of children. And within this little section, it's telling us that the whole tribe is going down to Egypt, and it's listing that whole group of people by their mothers, by the woman who gave them birth. So Leah has 33, Zilpah, Leah's maid, has 16, Rachel has 14, and Bilhah, Rachel's maid, has 7. And if you add that all up, you get 66. Now, however, if you look at the closing verses of this section, 26 and 7, it says, all the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 in total. Now, I'm bringing this up for a simple reason. That is, if you talk to people about the Lord in the Bible, there are some people who will go online and they'll search for contradictions in the Bible, and some people will come back to you and point this out as a contradiction. The close of this passage says that 70 people went into Egypt, and there's another passage elsewhere that says there were in fact 75 that went into Egypt. Now, what do we have to say about that? Well, there is an answer to that. Now, before I go any further, I'd just like to make the point that I've spent many, many years of my life studying the Bible. As a matter of fact, this year marks the 47th year since I became a Christian. Now, I grew up in a Christian household, but before I made even that personal decision to make the Lord the center of my life, even as a young child, I was interested in the Bible, and I grew up in a tradition where Bible study was the expected norm. And the Bible sort of seeped into me as a child. I then began to study it systematically about 35 years ago, and in doing so I've attempted to go through every book. Now, I haven't made my all the way through it yet in terms of a serious deep level of study, but I have read and studied through the complete Bible 7 times now, and it's more from a sort of a limited devotional point of view study each time. But as far as in-depth study goes, I haven't covered the whole Bible yet. I'm close, but I haven't looked at detail. I would say I'm shy of about 10 books of the 66 books that are there. But I'm working on those now, and that's part of this process. And I personally can't wait to address the shortfalls in my knowledge by completing the study by this podcast over the next 5 years or so. Now, the reason I bring this up is that the fact that the study of the Bible has been my passion. It isn't a chore for virtually all of my adult life. And if you do that, you bump into the kind of problem that I've just made you aware of in the last episode. The fact is that some people like to point out these so-called contradictions in the Bible. But I'm here to tell you that in my life, I've looked at virtually all of the well-known supposed contradictions in the Bible. And in every case, absolutely every case, I found there to be a completely reasonable explanation. As a matter of fact, it gets really interesting for me because I've always been interested in Scripture, and I love to figure out what the answers to these difficult questions might be. Now, don't get me wrong, I haven't discovered these answers for myself. In fact, they're often there, and there's sometimes even more than one answer to this alleged perceived problem. And many of those queries, nearly all of those queries, were answered long, long ago by some of history's great Bible teachers. It's just the knowledge, the biblical knowledge, that has got lost. As a society, more and more people lose their biblical literacy. Even people who come to faith nowadays, and a serious committed faith, don't have that biblical literacy in their background. So what that means, what I'm saying is, when someone comes to you and says there's a contradiction, and I've had many people say that to me over the years, it's a very common sort of opening statement that non-believers make. It's a common thing for people to come up with some sort of statement that say, oh, well, the Bible's full of contradictions. My standard answer to that question, to that statement is, and I believe it should be yours as well, is what particular contradiction are you talking about? I recommend that if you come up against this, you simply ask that question every time. Now, in other words, say, tell me the contradictions you're talking about. Now, you may feel nervous to make such a statement and ask such a question because perhaps you'd be fearful that what you might get back you won't be able to answer. But my friends, I can confidently tell you that 9 times out of 10, they won't be able to have one. They don't have one. They won't be able to express it. They've just heard this said about the Bible sometime in the past by someone else, and they're just repeating it. In the very rare occasion they too come back with something, you can probably say, you can just answer, well, I'll get back to you. And I promise you, a few minutes research online and you'll find that supposed contradiction has a very, very straightforward answer. But every once in a while, they bring up one of these contradictions. Now, I've made the decision that as we go through the Bible, there are about 7 or 8 main ones, and I'm going to address each one of them as they come up. Now, as I didn't address the first one of the most common ones, earlier in the book of Genesis, I'm going to quickly do it now before addressing the one that appears here. And then naturally, hopefully, we'll be able to help as we're confronted with other issues where there is a supposed conflict. But one of the most common ones I heard was, where did Cain get his wife? In other words, where did the first generation of children get their wives from? Now, you may have heard that, and because this story plays out in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And the question is, where did the children of Adam and Eve get their wives and husbands from? Now, have you ever heard that? I wonder if anybody's ever said something like that to you. You see, there appears to be a problem, but only because most people only know the bare bones of the creation story, and they think, well, Adam and Eve had 2 children, Cain and Abel, and they also perhaps even know that Cain killed Abel. So how did he get a wife? Well, let me give you an answer to this one, and this is the first one, and I'll give it to you for free. The answer is found in Genesis 5, verse 4. When it's closing off the story, it tells us, when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. So Adam had daughters, and it stands to reason at the beginning of the human race, then brothers and sisters would have married. Now, some people might say, whoa, that's a problem, that's incest, you can't marry your sister. Well, we know that today, and those laws were brought about today because it became recognized very soon with the Enlightenment and the development of education and some understanding of sort of family history, that if 2 close siblings marry each other, the mathematical calculation of a genetic weakness appearing in the form of a disability or a disadvantage coming through in the children was much, much greater if people married their close relatives. So that's why, through the unfolding of history, it gradually became forbidden until it is pretty much forbidden worldwide, all around the world today. But remember, this story goes right back into the mists of time, into the period of what Bible experts call the prehistory. And you've got to realize, you got to think, suppose your parents are perfect physically. That's what the Genesis story tells. Unaffected by sin. There wouldn't be any weaknesses in the genetic line at that point. And if your father and mother were Adam and Eve, that aspect of it wouldn't be a problem, would it? It took thousands of years for the effect of sin to affect the physical deterioration of the family line of Adam. And even that is cleverly demonstrated for us by the slow decline in life expectancy that is shown through the various family trees depicted as we work through the book of Genesis. Then eventually a prohibition came against marrying with siblings, but it came about many, many years later, over 1,000 years later, experts say, when it was written into the Mosaic Law. So there's no contradiction there in that particular one. Now, I bring that up because it's one of the most common contradictions. It's the first one that people often quote in the Bible, and as we've already passed it, I thought I'd try and answer it today. But that doesn't answer the fact that, as I referred to yesterday, that the book of Acts in the New Testament, Stephen gives an account of these events, and it seems to contradict what's been said so far. So let's just pick up, and I'll quickly read for you Acts 7, 11, 14. And this is what Stephen says. And he's explaining the events that we're studying today. Then a famine struck all Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering for our ancestors who could not find food. When Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers on their first visit. On their second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was, and Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and the whole family, 75 in all. So how do you reconcile the fact that it says 75 here, yet in the Genesis account it says 70? Well, look again at verse 14, and it actually says Joseph called his father Jacob and all his relatives, 75 in all. That is the specific word that is used, called. Do you see what that does? Do you see it says that 75 people were called into Egypt? It says he called 75 people to go to Egypt. It says nothing about the number that actually went. So there is clearly, technically, very clearly not a contradiction between Acts 7:14 and between the verses, the closing verse from last time, Genesis 46:27. Because Genesis 46:27's all the persons in the house of Jacob who actually went into Egypt were 70 in number. Therefore Joseph called potentially up to 75 people, but only 70 showed up. Maybe a few stayed behind because they had surrendered their lives over to the Canaanite way of living, having been married into it. So right, let's now go back to Genesis 46 and we'll try and finish these last remaining verses up to verse 30 and try to summarize what's going on here. We've gone all the way down to verse 27, so let's pick it up in verse 28, where it tells us, Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to get directions to Goshen when they arrived in the region of Goshen. So what's happening here is they've got close to Egypt and they send Judah, one of Jacob's sons, to see Joseph and say, We're here. Where do we go now? In other words, we've arrived. What do we do now? And it tells us Joseph sent them to the land of Goshen. 29 and 30 says, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms round his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive. It's not nice. All right, Jacob is just telling us that Jacob says, Amazing, I've got my long lost son back. I'm so happy I can die in peace now. So all this is telling us that they get to Egypt and Jacob and Joseph meet, and Jacob has a real sense of peace in finally finding his long lost son, the one who he thought was dead. However, this is the point at which we're going to pause in terms of the text, because up to this point, this section is actually a unit in its own right. It's the end of an episode in this particular story. In spite of the lack of a chapter break, because remember these chapter breaks were added much later on, I believe it's actually the end of this part of the story. And the point of the story so far is to say that these people, this extended family, left Canaan and they finally made it to Egypt. And they brought a total of 70 people with them. And then there's this wonderful, fantastic reunion between Jacob and his son Joseph. They've not seen each other for 23 years, so the Bible experts say. So you can imagine the absolute joy, the ecstatic experience that must have been for everyone. Now they were finally together. Now I think this is a simple story, a basic story about how 70 people come from Canaan to Egypt. I mean, that's basically the narrative of the story. And the only significant part of the story that really sticks out for me from a spiritual lesson is the fact that he paused and made a sacrifice. And then he got a word that what he was doing was okay. His decision to go down to Egypt was okay. So please note, I think the key thing to pick out of this is God did not appear to him before he decided to go. He confirmed it when he was on his way. And I think that's quite a significant thing in this passage. It's different to how decisions and calls have been made in the past up to this point. Maybe God's retreating slightly and allowing people to make decisions based on their common sense and their spiritual knowledge of having walked the path with God for a while. And the fact is what we see here is Jacob bases his decision initially on just common sense. And it turns out he made a decision that was not only in the will of God, but furthered the will of God, because God said, I'm going to get you down to Egypt, and I'm going to make you a great nation in Egypt. So his common sense decision was not against the will of God, it was in the will of God, and it even was able to further the will of God. So the point I want to make here is that a simple basis for making a decision can sometimes just be using your common sense. Let me clarify my position on what we can learn here. What I'm saying is, assuming that there's no scripture to the contrary, proceed according to your best judgment, whilst at the same time continuing to seek the Lord with prayer for guidance, because we can have confidence that the Lord will either bless that decision or else he will overrule and redirect it. And it's an amazing comfort to know that, isn't it? So here's the point I want to make today. It's incredibly simple, but it needs to be made where there is no clear statement, principle, or example in the scriptures of the Bible for making a decision. You are quite free just to use your common sense. Now, I think this is important because in the past, as you know, I've been a pastor, and in my experience, people often, when people are seeking the will of God in their decision making, they usually fall into one of two camps, particularly if they're struggling. There are those who are paralyzed in their decision making because they are waiting for God to move supernaturally in revealing the next steps for them, and they don't know how to use their God-given common sense. Of all the people I've ever come to talk to me and ask me questions or even advice about their future decisions making, anybody who's come to me in his role as pastor, I would say most of the time, the majority of the time, the question is answered by nothing more than making a common sense decision. Recently, a pastor I know contacted me because he needed some advice. Now, I couldn't imagine why he wanted advice from me. He was a highly intelligent man, went to a top university and was an ordained minister. He had a theology degree, great knowledge of the scripture, and had been in church leadership for much longer than me. What did he need to come to talk to me about advice? Well, in our discussions it came out that the church he had been pastoring had been surviving on past financial resources, and in spite of steady growth, it was still running out of money. So by mutual consent he'd agreed to resign. But now he found himself without a job, he was living on his severance. But the bottom line is he was about to run out of money, and he was fearful that he might have to move back to live with his parents at the age of 40 plus. As I listened to him describe the details of his dilemma, I learned that because he had lived in a church-provided house and all his bills had been paid, in fact, since leaving university, so a very long time, he had lived that way. He had had extremely low outgoings, no house bills to pay for nearly 20 years, but during that time he had still saved no money. He had expected to stay in a manse all his life, and maybe even he said he believed that he would be allowed to retire into one when he finished his time as a minister. Now, I said that he could pray that the Lord would open a door for some other kind of ministry, because he was a talented and gifted minister, and I said that praying about that would be a good thing to do. But also I said you should not wait for the Lord to open the door for ministry and just sit there waiting and doing nothing. He was planning to consider retraining as a teacher and looking for a role as a chaplain. So I said during the period of his retraining, then he should move back into his family home, which was being offered to him with open arms. But during his training time, set aside his grants and the money he would be given to save for a deposit for accommodation in 2 years' time. Now, what I was suggesting to him, to me, just felt like common sense. I even said maybe he could get a part-time job while studying his 2-year university course to save a couple for a bit extra during those years. Now, I have to say, I would have done that in a heartbeat as a young man. I think I would have even done it at the age of 40. That seemed to me just common sense. But I'm amazed today how many people who ask for advice and the advice they need is nothing more than common sense. But the thing I think it's worth saying is that common sense, biblical common sense, isn't really common anymore. I'm amazed at how uncommon common sense is these days. So let me repeat again what my advice is in nearly every situation where you're waiting on the Lord or you have an important decision to make. This is the point. Where there is no indication in Scripture as to what you would do, then just apply some simple common sense, because that can indeed be sanctified common sense. The Scripture also tells us that there is safety in a multitude of counselors. So if your decision making involves you thinking or gaining knowledge in an area that you feel you're not qualified in that particular area, go and talk with other people, wise people, spiritually minded people, people who you can then get their common sense about how you should react in that situation. If you don't have a good understanding about a subject, then go get it, friends. Don't feel like you've done something wrong. If God hadn't spoken, he expects you to use your common sense and to make a decision using it or finding it from other people. So what I believe we can be thankful for in reading this is the fact that through his words in the Bible, he has given us loads of heavenly wisdom that can give us advice in many directions in so many areas of their life. And we can also be thankful and take advantage of all those people who've studied this word before us, so that if it's new to us, if we're a new believer, or we don't struggle to know what the decision should be, we can still go to people who are experienced in that area of life and have walked that path themselves at some time, the path that we are going to need to walk, and they can give us advice. And I do hope the other thing that you can be thankful of is that you've been given a sound mind. I know we struggle sometimes, but generally we have been given a sound mind and some good sense and some good guidance that we can make decisions and make common sense decisions that, importantly, aren't overly influenced by the world, aren't overly influenced by materialism, and thereby, by doing that straightforward, simple, common sense thing, we can not only stay in God's will, but also, this passage tells us we can go further into his will in the future.